Welcome to the Success is Subjective podcast series brought to you by collegealternative.org, presented by Lilley Consulting. I'm your host, Joanna Lilley. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Grant Leibersberger. Grant is the founder and principal of Focus Collegiate and is a staunch advocate of experiential learning. Since he began his career in young adult and student advocacy, Grant has had an eye out for the niche opportunities for young people. As field director at Wilderness Quest, he was instrumental in the development of the first ever young adult wilderness therapy program in the country. His entrepreneurial spirit led him to shepherd other wilderness therapy and residential programs, eventually becoming the assistant director of Spruce Mountain Inn, a residential and transitional living program for young adults. He later became founding partner at Mansfield Hall, which is a residential community providing academic, executive functioning, social, and independent skills for college students. Grant's undergraduate degree is in experiential education, and he holds a master's degree in counseling from Northern Arizona University and an MBA from Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. He also serves on the board of directors and in leadership roles in several nonprofit organizations. There's a lot more that's going on right now in Grant's life, so let's not wait any further. Let's just dive right in so you can hear his journey and where he's been and where he is now. Here's Grant. Hi, Grant. I'm glad you're here.
Hi, Joanna. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. I'm super excited to have this conversation. So let's just dive right in. Why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners, where did you grow up and what was the messaging that you were getting from your family and the community in which you were raised about post-secondary education?
So as I was preparing myself for this, I was kind of reflecting on my, journey to post-secondary ed. And I realized that, so I grew up pretty humble pie outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And I realized as I was thinking about this is that even though I had a lot of higher education support around me, or at least people were headed that direction, is that I am first generation in terms of who graduated from college. My mother, a couple of years after I graduated herself. So just because that was the case, it didn't mean that there wasn't a large push towards post-secondary ed, even from when I was quite young. And I think I realized, and the teachers around me realized, that I had some kind of intellectual bandwidth to kind of continue. And so there were always goals that were always going to need a higher education background in order to achieve this type of career stuff. So, and then as I was growing up, I was in public education, and my mother knew I was bored. And so she appealed to the local private school, and which was a radical difference from my public education when I started to attend private school when I was a freshman on a little bit of scholarship money. And, the differences between public ed in kind of rural Ohio and then all of a sudden private school where everyone is like, it's 30% IVs, the caliber and the pressure got a lot higher. And then that's when you kind of conform. And so obviously everybody's going to higher ed. Now it's just a matter of who's getting into Harvard and who's going to the Ohio State University, AKA no one. And so because you're coming from a small, private, and so, D3 schools are desirable, big schools are not, because you're coming from, I graduated with 30 or 35 students out of 125, kid 9 through 12 experience. So it was really small. And what I realized is that, I do well in those smaller environments. And yet when I went to propel myself I started looking at larger institutions in order to break out a little bit. But then I always kept coming back to small, intimate settings, discussion-based settings. But the message, and then, on my mother's sister's side, she had an MBA, my uncle had an MBA from Wharton. There was a lot of high achieving folks around me who you kind of aspire to this stuff.
So with all that information, then kind of what was your post-sec? I'm just going to assume, right? Yeah. Because that's where we're at, that you did go to school based on kind of what you just laid out. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to necessarily share where you went unless you want to, but I would just love to kind of hear what that college experience was like for you.
It's kind of an interesting journey. The pressure to conform led me to a small D3 school in Ohio because other people were going there. And I just assumed, okay, well, then this is what other people are doing, so this is what I'm going to do. So a small college in Springfield, Ohio called Wittenberg offered me the most money. So that's where I went. And immediately I didn't quite realize what 80% Greek life means and how I was ill prepared for the structure and we'll just say the rowdiness and just kind of the overall lack of discipline, I think, that comes with being a freshman in that environment. And it's not that I didn't have a lot of freedom in high school because I worked a job almost full time. I went to school full time, in a high achieving school. So, but it was just the culture was not conducive to where I wanted to be. So I left Wittenberg, after my first semester, which, informs my experience down the line, my current company. But I left and I moved back to Cleveland, and then eventually I made my way to a place that I was really aspiring to. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I wanted to be an outdoor educator. And the only place, kind of like the Harvard at the time of outdoor education, is a small institution in Prescott, Arizona called Prescott College. And so I made my way to Prescott, Arizona, and I got a bachelor's degree in experiential education, which again has a lot of good information down the line. Then embarked on a career in wilderness therapy since I was out west, and got a master's degree in counseling from Northern Arizona University. That was just by circumstance, because that's the area with which I was living and working. And then eventually, as I moved back east and I went back to Cleveland for a spell, I had been invited into the leadership of a lot of these organizations and part of understanding how to run organizations is budgets and HR and these things that are not germane towards a therapist or a experiential educator. So when I knew I was going to be landlocked in Cleveland for a couple of years, taking care of my folks, I went and got an MBA from Case. So that was and I realized at the time that these are the skills that I needed, because I wanted to see if I was doing it right, because you never really know if you don't have a lot of mentors, and these are not very highly structured corporate environments, and they're all really small businesses. And so you don't get a lot of affirmation that you're doing it correctly. And so, but that, those kind of three different experiences really informs where I am today.
Well, and I love that you said that too, right? Like an experiential educator and a counselor, like the number one skill that doesn't really align is running and operating the business side of a business.
Right. Yep.
I empathize a little too much.
And I also thought, and you and I have been in this cottage industry for a really long time, right? So I thought that maybe I was going to pivot out of this cottage industry by getting an MBA and maybe go into healthcare management or some different, but like they say, they always keep pulling me back into the Godfather movies. And so I kept, being pulled back into our little cottage industry, and to which I love. And I realized and this is going to date this podcast, but as I was in Seattle this last, for the Independent Educational Consultants Association conference, that was my 25th year of IECA conferences. I was like, whoa. So that kind of freaked me out a little bit. But.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, so I love how you kind of planted the seed earlier too about, hey, I went to this school because they gave me the most money, and very quickly it ended up not being the right environment for you, which then obviously segues to the kind of the foundation, right, for the work that you're doing now. So having heard kind of your journey and transitioning, returning back to Cleveland, then going to getting your degree at Prescott, getting your master's at Northern Arizona University, then getting your MBA. I mean, the journey is building, right? You're creating this kind of educational trail of degrees, but it's all of it is kind of coming together, right? Like the confluence of the work that you're doing now. So why don't you just tell us, what are you doing?
Well, so in the midst of all that, I think it's used to have a little bit of background is that most of the organizations that I was working for, interspersed with getting advanced degrees, were all either turnarounds or startups. And so a lot of this was building these things from the ground. And I was instrumental in bringing about another, company that worked with young adults, college students who are on the spectrum. But I also worked with young adult college students who had a mental health background. College interrupted is what we call it, when you go and, and you're not very successful. And then there's a lot of collateral fallout from all of that. And how do you, get back on? And so I've always been interested in moving towards, for lack of a better word, lesser restrictive environments. So from residential, from wilderness to young adult transition into kind of back into college, to transition to college. And now, about 5 years ago, I had an idea to open up a company that is exclusively going to help young adults pivot towards their higher education experience in the context of the college that they got into. There's a lot of supports out there for young adults, particularly with learning differences, to go to very specific colleges or very specific programs that are designed to support either LD or ASD, or these are just acronyms that I'm assuming your listeners know, but learning differences or autism spectrum type of characteristics. But what I found over the years is that there's a high demand for young people who don't want to necessarily be stigmatized or identified. And so they want to go to a more traditional, if you will, I don't know if traditional is the right word, but traditional mainstream, university. And so I felt like there was plenty of demand and certainly interest in students getting to their college of choice. And so how do you implement an experience that is going to support that? And so our current company is called Focus Collegiate, and it is based out of Boston. And we both serve students who are in person in their Boston area colleges, of which there are like 50, and then around the country through Collegiate Virtual, which is more of a virtual remote experience for almost any other college in the U.S. So it's pretty broad, and I think the students have oftentimes a unique learning profile, and so we have to kind of cater each experience to each student, because obviously everybody is different. But we have a whole lot of different ways of how we do assessment, how we engage our students, how relationship is first, how we ensure that students are making, the right choices, informing their decision-making process. So it's not tutoring, it's not executive functioning coaching. It's actually a much more holistic approach, which is what I found, right? If you may go to a school, and if you're academically proficient, that's fantastic. If you can't find a friend, that's problematic. Everything kind of informs each other. If you are academically proficient, but you lack organizational capacity, that is also a problem. So our goal is to really work with the student in a holistic way to help them survive in a way that I was unable to in my first semester at school. And sometimes it's about making a fundamentally different choice than the choice that you made. And our podcast in season 2 of Focus Collegiate College Unbound is you don't know what you don't know. And so for most of us, learning to become a young adult and a college student is learning what maybe you don't want to be doing. And so that's kind of the message that our institution brings to our students, is that we're learning about the student's journey together.
Well, I love how you continue to hammer home the fact that it really is holistic, and it is available to anybody, at any institution who
Correct.
Maybe doesn't want to necessarily go to a particular school because they have a specific program, which we know there's a very small, number of those schools that exist. And quite honestly, it's not necessarily a good fit for every student. So I think the other thing that is kind of resonating with me right now as you're talking too is, parents are often, and I know you see this, I definitely see it. Parents are constantly scrambling. Oh, I need an executive functioning coach, or I need an academic coach, or I need some sort of life coach, right? So each of these people can be very siloed in the work that it is that they're doing. But what you're describing with Focus Collegiate really sounds not just intentional, but it's kind of the one-stop shop.
That is true. It is the one-stop shop. And what we found, in this particular journey, because our students, and I've still not come up with a great terminology for this, but some of our students do not have documentation. They may have learning differences or gaps in their learning profile, but they're undocumented. Terrible word for this, but I haven't come up with another one. And we have students who carry diagnostics, true diagnostics, identifiable, neuropsychological reports. And so, how do you craft an experience that's going to support both of those types of learners? And since everything is so diverse, it actually has to be holistic, can't be siloed. And what I found is, frankly, if you're hiring a tutor, sometimes tutoring isn't about the subject area. It is about resiliency. It's about stick-to-itiveness. It is about making decisions to knuckle down on a paper or press send if it's not perfect. These are the impediments that have very little to do with content, but has everything to do with content. Because if you don't press send, you're going to be behind. And if you're behind, then you're overwhelmed. And then all the other stuff starts creeping in. So what we found is the ability of our different support specialists to be able to talk to each other, so we can create interventions that are consistent with the staff person's area of expertise. Although most of my team would say, well, we do everything, which is probably true, because we're humans and we're working with other humans. And so we try to meet the need as it arises. And I think that's the other takeaway from our model, at least, and why I implemented it this way, is that we have to have enough bandwidth to be able to solve the problem in the moment. We can't wait until the problem exacerbates itself several days later, when sometimes somebody has an hour on Calendly to be able to solve the thing that the student won't probably even activate themselves enough to make the appointment in the first place. So we remove all of the friction of getting support and don't waste time by helping the student solve the issue in the moment. And that requires, full-time staff, well compensated, everyone with a PhD or a master's degree in their area of discipline, a really collegial team that can be responsive, that is a bias towards action. So that's how this whole thing goes, and I think goes successfully.
Well, I actually want to ask one quick question too, a little bit off script. And then I do want to ask kind of that pointed question of, like, now that we've seen and heard everything kind of about your journey, obviously I do want to ask you directly whether or not you see yourself as successful. But you also just kind of hinted this piece too about the podcast that you all are doing. So can you just actually just give like the elevator pitch of what do you all talk about? Who's the audience? And then you can even just segue naturally, honestly, into that question if you see yourself as successful.
So the podcast is called College Unbound. You can find it where you find your podcasts, as they say. And we have several seasons of it. The first season is really us, frankly, talking about the Focus Collegiate journey and the different silos of support and how, really we're making the case about integration of these. And we also talk a lot about our, if you want to learn about how Focus Collegiate works, listen to the podcasts. It's pretty much all there. The secret sauce is laid out. But because I think it's a lot of people will say that we are goal oriented or student driven, but I think it's different to operationalize it. You can say it, but operationalizing it is a different thing. And so the first season is about that. The second season, we actually interview a bunch of folks who are in our orbit about different areas of transition to college that maybe parents haven't thought about. Most of our audience are, frankly, our parents, and especially ones who are considering a pivot to higher education and whether their young person needs support or not. So we have, for example, I'm really high on occupational therapy as a support, and so we have a whole silo of support in Focus Collegiate that is OT driven and also career driven. And so we spend a lot of time interviewing people who are kind of outside of the traditional educational support orbit, because that really greatly informs who we do. Like motivational interviewing as a construct is something that we implement greatly, kind of behavioral economics and decision-making skills and motivation. Like these are core concepts that are super important that are outside of what, people normally talk about when you're talking about podcasts. In our season 3, we haven't, we've launched it. I think we've only done 2 or 3 episodes. So to be determined. I think we're a little bit behind this year in this. We may be doing a little bit more in social media than the podcast this semester, but we'll pick it back up again in the fall.
Well, that's, I guess, another kind of byproduct of operating the business, right?
Right.
Business side of the business. So, okay, I'm going to ask you directly. Having heard that, you're running a podcast, you're running a business, you've had quite the journey career-wise, so like professionally and personally. Do you see yourself as successful?
Well, yes, I do. And, but if I had to dream it up when I was 18 years old, I wouldn't be like, oh, this is what it looks like, because it's a disjointed journey. And, there are setbacks and there are places, I think one of in particularly for families, and I have the luxury of being grown up humble pie, but learn to play golf at the Greenwich Country Club, is that I've seen both, kind of both sides of the equation. And I think in some of these contexts, the journey is so mapped out for the young person already. I mean, or the choices are very narrow that any deviation from that pathway can be devastating almost. And so I think some of the things even we talk about at Focus Collegiate, but the psychological flexibility to be able to pivot in the face of friction or different results, or, I got into Yale, but I ended up going to Case. It's okay, right? Like these types of things that are ultimately okay because and it's not in context of what other people are doing. And I think that's the challenge, is if it's a high achieving community, everyone's always looking around and seeing what else everyone else is doing. And sometimes that level of comparison isn't necessarily reality. And so I think being able to appreciate where you are, and here's the experiential educator in me, taking the lessons from the moment that you're in and applying them is far more important than a brand.
So true. Okay, so I'm thinking as you were talking to my next question is, if you could give one piece of advice to a young adult that's struggling, what advice would you give? Which is extremely vague. I also, in thinking about I could put a spin on it, maybe more focused towards Focus Collegiate potential students, or even kind of like Grant, circa 18, right? First gen college student seeking out what's the best college experience. And, I can't narrow it down. I usually can. So I'm a little bit of an open book right now and saying, Grant, take it away, and however you want to answer this question.
Well, it could be a whole other podcast. I have like a list of principles that we operate off of internally that are written for my team, right? Because it's a different way of looking at life versus giving advice to a young person. But it's been my experience with young adults is that, sometimes, and I said this earlier, sometimes the process of becoming a young adult is learning what you don't want to be doing. So even though, and it's not about quitting, right? It's learning what you don't want to be doing, but finishing the thing that you don't like and then pivoting to the thing that you might want more. So it's kind of double-edged. It's like, first of all, you have to pick a direction and go to know whether you're going to like it or not in the first place. So I see, and I'm not sure if it's a generational thing, but I see a lot more dithering in decision-making for young people. And I think there's a lot of anxiety because there's a lot of choice. And so I think it's far more important to pick a direction and go and be comfortable with an uneven performance or even a little bit of a failure also, but with the mindset, you're going to take away and learn something, and eventually you'll get to where you want to be. So I think that's the usual advice. And it usually doesn't come all at once to a young person because they're having these experiences over the way. So it's like, you're learning things that you don't want to be doing. How do we pivot to success, right? So there's a usual progression, and some people faster than others, but I think even in the recovery world, for lack of a better word, there's an old adage, wherever you go, there you are. So I think being comfortable with who you are and how you get to be comfortable with who you are is as equally as important as building some of those, at the end of the day, resiliency skills, which is, grinding it out a little bit, even in the face of it's not your preferred activity at the moment.
I just heard some students. So the description grindy was something that it just blew my mind. I only just learned this recently. So as you're sharing that information, I was like, yeah, okay, that's super helpful. And then it took me back to learning something new, even at my age. So old dog can learn new tricks, or for this population of young people.
Well, and I'm also reminded that that college, I mean, we look at it differently as a lens of a parent or an educator, but college is a novel environment for a young adult. They don't know what they don't know. So they're going into something that is unscripted. A lot of young people think they know what they're getting into, but they never really do. So being able to appreciate the fact that this can be a dysregulating event in this novel environment, which frankly, though, novel environments are highly correlated with educational outcomes, right? So because it's about taking risks and it's about successful resiliency and all of these things. And so that's the beauty of the moment of going to college, is that all of these metaphors are embedded in the experience, but it's how it plays itself out that ultimately will determine whether you feel like success is subjective or not, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Grant. Let's wrap this up. So why don't you actually go ahead and how can folks connect with you? And I will make sure that I do include I know you said College Unbound. You can find it on any podcast platform. So we'll make sure we have some links for folks to also connect there too, in case for whatever reason they don't know how to find it. But how can people connect with you?
Yeah, so easily enough to go to our website, www.focuscollegiate.com. There are actually links to all of my staff. Please don't go emailing all of my staff, but include myself included, so you can click and then my email will come up. But easily enough, it's grant@focuscollegiate.com is probably the best, most efficient way. Or if you dialed into the main numbers on the website, you'll eventually get to me as well. So.
Well, I'm always grateful for any guest that comes on the podcast, because it, we know about some of our journeys, and sometimes it's kind of tangential. Depends on how long you've been kind of working or crossing paths. And obviously I was aware with what you were doing now, but not necessarily the full history. And I know that there's going to be some parents or young adults listening to this, or even some other people that kind of work in our space that maybe didn't know about some of these details about your own journey. And so I just really am grateful for you for taking the time to chat with me, share that information, and impart the wisdom, not just in the work that you're doing and the business that you've created, but just in this like ongoing gift of like, if you are a young adult, here's just some thoughts on things that might make your own young adult journey a little bit smoother.
Yep. And, please don't, I think your listeners, please don't hesitate to call. We're in the business. We're not just in the business of enrolling students in Focus Collegiate. We also are guides for educational consultants or families who are looking for, looking for alternatives. And if we're not it, we're not it. And we're happy to say so. But at the same time, I guess we all have a bias for action. So instead of, just thinking about it, give us a call and we'll help you get in the right place if we're not it.
Well, you heard it, folks. Contact Grant. Don't email all the staff. Just reach out to Grant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant.
All right. Thanks, Joanna.
That's it for this week's Success is Subjective episode. I want to thank my guests for joining me on this week and for being willing to share your journey. This podcast would not exist if it wasn't for people such as yourself. Stay tuned for the next episode where you can bet it'll be another amazing human sharing their personal story with the world. Make sure you check out the show notes where you will find contact information, website details, and all social media for our guests. And also put a face with a voice by accessing their interview on the newly formed successissubjective.org website. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, you can email me at Joanna, Joanna, at successissubjective.org. I would also be remiss if I didn't tell you to check out the collegealternative.org and lilyconsulting.com websites for additional resources outside of podcasting. If you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, please do me a favor and subscribe. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review. You can also download to listen to Success is Subjective on any other popular podcast apps such as Amazon, Audible, Google, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. And last but not least, Success is Subjective is listener supported, made possible by me and by you. You can show support for the continuation of this podcast by donating on the successissubjective.org website. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, there is no single path through life. Success is what you make it.
Do you have a teenager or young adult who seems to have lost their way? Maybe they need help navigating adolescence, adulthood, and decisions surrounding higher education. Or maybe they have become withdrawn, their grades are slipping, or they are flat out living a reckless lifestyle, and you're concerned about their health and well-being. If this describes what your teen or young adult is facing, a therapeutic consultant may be able to help. Mental health, addiction recovery, and higher education can all be equally expensive. While information is everywhere, how do you know what option is the best one for your family? Some parents have the time to research and navigate this on their own. Some don't. If the latter applies to you, enter therapeutic consultants. Therapeutic consultants, like Joanna, listen to your family's specific needs and advocate on behalf of your loved one. TCs will research therapeutic resources, recommend treatment programs, and assist during adulthood transitions. Not being affiliated with any program, their support is completely objective and catered toward the best interest of each unique family. To find a qualified therapeutic consultant to work with, check out TCA, also known as the Therapeutic Consulting Association. Their website is therapeuticconsulting.org, all one word. Again, that's therapeuticconsulting.org. Then click the Find a Pro tab up at the top.